But first, the life and loves of a passionate musician, the women behind a great man of 20th century music, the Passions of Vaughan Williams.
Ralph Vaughan Williams is the giant of 20th century English music, perhaps the greatest composer of symphonies this country has ever produced, with a magical sound that is all his own. For many people, his music encapsulates Englishness, whether he's describing our character, our countryside, or larks ascending. But there's far more to Vaughan Williams than wistful evocations of the English landscape. This film explores the enormous musical range of an energetic, red-blooded man of both spirituality and passion.
Lord, yes. Passionate man, absolutely no doubt about it. Passionate and erotic.
I fell madly in love with him the moment I met him, and most women did.
Vaughan Williams died 50 years ago, but his young widow Ursula lived on until only last year. The story of their secret love affair can now be told. It nourished the fires within him, crystallized his moral dilemmas, and fertilized his music.
He was very tall, very beautiful, and he was perfect. And I adored him.
Through most of Vaughan Williams's 85 years, one of his abiding passions was women. He not only loved them, he liked them, and he needed them. They fed his creativity.
I remember going to a Christmas party one day and looking round the room, and there were a lot of disconsolate-looking men in couples talking to each other. And there was Ralph sitting on the sofa with 5 women at his feet and another 5 hanging over the back and a couple on either side of him.
So he really did have pulling power.
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
He used to call the wine waiter over and say to him, "And what's the strongest aperitif you've got?" And the chap would probably suggest something. And he said, "Well, 2 doubles, please." And we started the dinner like that. Obviously, he was determined to make it as nice as possible, I suppose.
He was a touching man anyhow, but I think he was a touching man too with his hands. He gave you a good old pat if you did something. You know, he liked the feeling that you would put your hand on your knee and say, "Well, come on, we'd better do this and that."
But Ursula said, and I'm sure it was true, nothing from the waist downwards.
Vaughan Williams was first captivated by Ursula long before they became husband and wife, when he was 65 and she was 27. But at that point, she was married, and so was he. In fact, he'd been married for 40 years. As a young man, he'd fallen for the cool pre-Raphaelite beauty of Adeline Fisher, a cousin of Virginia Woolf. She played the cello rather better than Ralph played the viola. He wrote to a relative to announce their engagement. "She is 2 years older than I am. For many years we've been great friends, and for about the last 3 I have known my mind on the matter."
Against her feet, wove and unwove it, wound and found.
I do remember she had a lovely voice, a wonderful way of speaking. It was a sort of deep, very articulated voice. Once you'd heard it, you never forgot it.
She had this aquiline nose and rather much in the air, and very thin and a long neck, I seem to remember. Very aristocratic looking.
They spent their honeymoon in 1897 in Berlin and stayed in Europe for 6 months to escape what Vaughan Williams had already realised were the clutches of Adeline's extensive family.
One of the things that Rafe resented was that she was absolutely oriented on her family.
She had her mother's obsession with looking after the sick.
And if one of her brothers or anything even had started sneezing, she had to go and look after them.
Vaughan Williams still had to make his mark as a composer and find his own voice. He'd been struggling to prove himself ever since his student days at the Royal College of Music, under the guidance of 2 leading composers of the time, Hubert Parry and Charles Villiers Stanford.
One of the first things I ever showed Stanford was the slow movement of a string quartet. I worked feverishly at it, and like every other composer, I thought it was the greatest work that ever had been written. And not only that, this was my swan song, that I'd never write anything again. And so I went there, all hit up, thinking my master would fall on his knees at my feet and say, "Here's the genius at last." Stanford turned it over and dismissed the Kurt, "All rot, my boy." That's all I heard about that piece. As far as I can remember, he was quite right. Luckily the piece was lost years ago.
Living with Adeline in Westminster, he combined his composing efforts with research into English folk song and edited the music for a pioneering new hymn book, the English Hymnal. It resulted in some of his most famous tunes.
There's nothing like a huge congregation singing a Vaughan Williams hymn. I mean, it is one of the most stirring experiences. I can never sing, it just moves me to tears.
Vaughan Williams himself was an agnostic, but he had a passion for giving those who did go to church good tunes to sing. He was happy to adapt some from folk songs with what he liked to call sexular associations. Half a century later, living in a much bigger London house, he still had his zest for hymns and Christmas carols, as Simona Pakenham discovered. She'd been so hooked by all his later music that she'd written a book about it, and their mutual friend, the actress Jill Balkan, tried to get them to meet.
He rang up Jill Balkan and said, "Who is this Simona Pakenham? Does she wear baggy tweed skirts and flat-heeled shoes?"
Yes, that is lovely.
"Or can I ask her to tea?"
"Oh, shall I ask her to tea?" Yes.
And Jill said, "Oh, no, it's all right, you can ask her to tea."
And tea is a very discreet thing, isn't it? I mean, if you're meeting a new lady friend, mind you, Ursula was going to be there, but I mean, asking someone to tea's okay, isn't it?
And I was absolutely terrified. I arrived much too early, inevitably, and walked round Regent's Park in a state of great dread. And Ursula opened the door, and Rafe was on the bottom of the stairs, and he spread out his arms, and he said, "My dear, you know my hymn books." And he was far more pleased with that than the fact that I knew his symphonies.
Simona is such a beautiful woman, too. That would have appealed to him.
And then the next thing he said was, "You must look at Ursula's petticoat." So he heaved up her skirt, and she had a bright yellow petticoat with black lace. So that was my first meeting with him. I hadn't expected him to be quite so gorgeous as he was.
By the time he reached his mid-30s, Vaughan Williams had yet to produce a major orchestral score. When it came in the shape of his First Symphony, it had the self-confidence of someone who'd been writing symphonies all his life.
The beginning of it, I think, is one of the great beginnings of any work written by anybody in any country. I think the opening of the Sea Symphony is just mind-blowing.
You felt the sea almost shifting under you. You were there in the blustering waves. You entered things through his imagination. That was his magic.
It wasn't just imagination. The symphony had taken years of struggle, at one point almost killing him. He'd been wrestling with it in Yorkshire when he went for a swim off a deserted beach near Robin Hood's Bay. The sea was rougher than he thought, and he found to his horror that he couldn't scramble back onto the rocks. The symphony's first audience had no idea how close a shave he'd had.
He was already 38. That is a late composer. Was Mozart not already dead at that point?
He was on the point of giving up in despair and exhaustion and letting himself drown. But a freak wave lifted him right onto the shore and preserved him for 50 more years and 8 more symphonies.
He was a late developer, and he went on developing right on till the end of his life.
1910 was a turning point. On top of the Sea Symphony, Vaughan Williams combined his passions for hymns, folk songs and Tudor music to create a quite different modern masterpiece, the Fantasia on a theme of Thomas Tallis. Its first performance in Gloucester Cathedral marked him out as a composer unlike any other. He used to say that any composer worth his salt had at least one piece in him that could not have been written by anyone else. This was it.
I'm sure he had the cathedral acoustic in mind as he wrote this piece, with that long, long reverberation time, the beautiful resonance too of a stone building. Very important moment for him. And we don't know if we're in 3-time or 4-time. That's another thing. There's no conventional rhythm here. And now VW lets the orchestra flower.
It's a work of astonishing originality. I seem to remember that at that concert there was Ivor Gurney and Herbert Howells, 2 composers who were ultimately to become important on the English scene. They were walking around the streets all night because of Tallis' Fantasia, which was a totally new world.
At last, VW was on his way. When he turned his musical imagination to his beloved London, he had the colours to do it. Thanks to lessons he'd had from the young French composer Maurice Ravel, he'd achieved a distinctive Vaughan Williams sound. As a resident for 20 years or more, he preferred to call his London symphony Symphony by a Londoner.
This idea of VW as a countryman has always been rubbish. I mean, he may have been born in the country, but he lived most of his life in London, and he liked London. He liked art galleries and theatres and seeing friends. It's probably the richest and most romantic score of them all in many ways. And I heard him say, and he's a very old man indeed, I can't score like that now, I can't get that richness.
His involvement in the Great War led inevitably to a change in the colour and temper of his music. At 42, Vaughan Williams was over age, so he pretended he was 39 and volunteered for the ranks, to the despair of some of his friends. The cantata Dona Nobis Pacem, Give Us Peace, was his own war requiem, though he was no pacifist.
He had a great feeling for manly life, and I think the army made a great impression on him, the absolute goodness of these people.
He wasn't a natural soldier. He found it difficult. He enjoyed the camaraderie hugely and organised music wherever he went. But he found looking tidy very difficult.
Private Vaughan Williams joined the Royal Army Medical Corps and was sent to northern France as a wagon orderly. He ferried the wounded on stretchers from the frontline trenches near Vimy Ridge to makeshift dressing stations. It gave him first-hand insight into the realities of war, which coloured his music in the years to come. He described going up night after night with the ambulance wagon at Équivre, up the steep hill where in the midst of war he was impressed by what he called the wonderful Corot-like landscape in the sunset. A new symphony began to germinate in his mind, which he rather misleadingly called the Pastoral. People said it suggested a cow looking over a gate, or VW rolling over and over in a field. But if there's any landscape here, it's a French one, and a disturbing one at that. It's wartime music, he told Ursula later, not lambkins frisking.
I think he maybe saw the irony of it, that this was, after all, or could have been a pastoral scene if it hadn't been blasted by war. It's deeply uncomfortable music, actually. It gives me that feeling as though you're standing somewhere with a cool breeze blowing on the back of your neck, and you're not sure whether you're really enjoying it or whether actually it's rather scary. I wonder, why do people keep talking about, cowpats and English countryside? Because to me it seemed the most ominous and dark and formidable, threatening work even. Vaughan Williams uses in this movement a natural horn and natural trumpet, which only plays the notes of the harmonic series, which are a little bit out of tune. They don't have piston stops to modify the notes, and I think he wants to get that open air feeling that you get on folk instruments or on bugles. I always think in the slow movement of the Pastoral Symphony you're hearing something rather like a last post for the dead in the trenches.
By the time Ralph came back to Adeline in Chelsea, the war had marked them both. Ralph grieved for friends like his fellow composer George Butterworth, lost at the front. He wrote that he dreaded returning to normal life with so many gaps. And Adeline had lost a brother in the naval battle of Jutland, a blow from which she never recovered. She wore black for the rest of her life. But there were other problems too. Even before the war, Adeline had contracted arthritis, and Ralph now found she was in increasing pain and often confined to a wheelchair, though she was only in her 40s. It meant in the end he had to forsake London for the Surrey he'd known as a boy. To make life easier for her, he went into exile, as he once put it, on the edge of the town of Dorking, where he composed in somewhat sombre surroundings.
I think it was what one might call a high-minded marriage. Adeline played a close role in everything he did. She listened to all his music on the wireless in later years when she couldn't go to the concerts herself. She wrote a lot of his letters, not for him, but to his dictation.
He did a great deal for her. And, I mean, I think more than most husbands would do. I mean, I think he was to really look after her, give her baths and help her do her hair. But it was hopeless. It just got worse and the pain was bad.
Quite how much of close romantic attachment there was after the early years, I'm not sure, but I suspect it became less so quite quickly.
The exile in Surrey was to last almost a quarter of a century. He and Adeline never had children, but there were usually members of Adeline's family staying with them at the White Gates, and other guests were somewhat wary.
A dark house inside.
Very strange house, really.
A little bit like going into a church.
And it's a balcony. I suppose the bedrooms were up in the balcony.
And Adeline was in a wheelchair with a rug over her.
With a green eyeshade.
I remember particularly seeing her, when she was to have a cup of tea, sort of stuffing a handkerchief into the handle of the cup so that she could hold onto it like that and drink it for herself.
I don't think she was very experienced with rumbustious boys of our age. So after a bit we were turned out into the garden.
There might have been a sandwich coming my way, and I might have carefully tipped a little tea into my mouth, but I was there as part of the baggage. I wasn't there to be shown around.
Vaughan Williams did regularly escape to London by train, where he drew sustenance from his female students at the Royal College of Music and from other young musicians he worked with.
The letters he wrote to these younger women all signed Uncle Ralph, and he would put kisses on it and say, I claim these when I see. Well, it was all very innocent and light-hearted.
When he wrote a concerto for the glamorous pianist Harriet Cohen, all he asked in return was 10,000 kisses, and in his frequent letters he kept a close tally of the balance he was owed.
He needed youth. And that was why he got to know us all at the college.
There's a very charming story about how Vaughan Williams would slowly climb up to the top floor of the Royal College of Music when a particularly beautiful young violin student would be practicing. And he would just climb all that way, look into the window for just a few moments, and climb all the way back down to his teaching studio.
He rather shocked me on one occasion because I had a friend. He said to her, how's your love life, my darling? I think he realized I was rather horrified. He said, oh, well, they told me everything, and I'm sure they did. He was, I think, a Shakespearean character.
Large, bumbling.
Spread all over the chairs, his huge shoulders, and a certain amount of tongue.
And it had about 3 shelves on it, and on each one was a cat.
Oh, yes, always a cat.
I don't want to be rude, but sort of resemblance to a sack of potatoes comes to mind.
He wore a 3-piece heavy tweed suit, even though it was high summer.
With his waistcoat skew whiff, and you suspect there's probably a stain on his tie. I love the dishevelled aspect of Vaughan Williams.
I think it was because the other professors were so neat and dapper and always looked as if they'd just shaved. He didn't look like that exactly. I don't know that he did shave a great deal.
Musically, Vaughan Williams was just as much aerial as Falstaff. He knew how to work his charms on the young. The singer Robert Teare first sang this setting of Shakespeare 50 years ago, and was amazed when the veteran composer turned up to hear him and his fellow students rehearse.
So it's just wonderful.
I was 18 and I was singing with King's College Cambridge Choir. We came down to St Bartholomew's Church in Smithfield, and there was this haystack of a man, hugely big, sitting on a very small chair, looking, to mix metaphors, a little bit like a sofa with the stuffing coming out. And he was enormously impressive. And we went to introduce ourselves to him, and he produced this enormous black ear trumpet in which we had to bellow our names. It was sort of a bit like meeting Beethoven.
It was while teaching students in London in the mid-1920s that Vaughan Williams produced a work which demonstrates how much he depended on the young, particularly women, to motivate him. Flos Campi, or Flower of the Field, was inspired by the ecstatic love poetry of the biblical Song of Songs, verses of which head every movement.
Flos Campi absolutely got me. I think, anyone that doesn't know Vaughan Williams well, I would absolutely defy them to identify that as Vaughan Williams.
The origins of Flos Campi intrigued Michael Kennedy while he was working on his definitive study of the composer. Vaughan Williams himself gave a clue. "Those pimps at the BBC," he said, "think it's religious. In fact, it's the most passionate piece I ever wrote."
It's almost an erotic work, and the reason for it was that he was very taken with, I think, a young girl at the Royal College of Music in those days. And when Ursula and I were doing our books together, we exchanged lots of letters. And she wrote to me about this, and she said to me, I'm reading the letter now, "I think Flos is not much mystical, but about Ralph's most sensual, sensuous work. He behaved rather badly, I think, to a woman who was obviously rather in love with him, as he used to go and see her rather a lot then, to work himself up into the terrific state he needed to be in to write it, but never went far enough to get actually involved. Rather a fine tightrope performance. He was much surprised when I said I thought it was immoral to go so far and no further."
There was another young woman in Surrey who was burnt by the Vaughan Williams flame. For years he'd been harvesting the efforts of village choral societies and amateur orchestras for the Leith Hill Musical Festival. Its secretary was Frances Farrer, or Fanny as she was known. She was more than 20 years Ralph's junior, but they became close.
I think it was probably the most important relationship of her life. What it was to him, I really don't know, but he was obviously very, very fond of her.
I think Adeline was already quite considerably an invalid at that time, wasn't she? So he needed somebody to keep him company. He liked her being so dashing. He said, "Take me up for a drive in your car," and I think they went very fast round the corners, probably.
The family treasures the manuscripts he gave Fanny, and his jokily affectionate letters.
He says, "My darling Sec," and I tend to be kind conductor or your conductor.
Your loving conductor.
Your loving conductor, yes, indeed. Making arrangements to meet. It was so lovely to see you. Those sort of things.
Longing to see you again?
Yes, yes.
Aunt Fan, according to her family, was an energetic get-up-and-go character. She ran the festival and sometimes wrote lyrics for Ralph to set to music. But she wasn't a musician herself. So when Ralph was asked to write a piece for amateurs to play at the opening of a village hall in 1925, he arranged a folk dance with a simple percussion part for Fanny. Fanny never talked of her friendship with him, and wanted his letters burned after her death, telltale signs in her family's view of a broken heart.
When I was about 12 or something, I wanted a pair of binoculars, and Aunt Fan had two, so she gave me one, and they're lovely binoculars. Obviously water surplus, they got the water stamp on them, and in a lovely leather case, so I thought they were great. And then about a week later she said, "I'm going to give you a new case for those binoculars I gave you, and I'll have the other one back." So I thought this was slightly odd. But I looked at the case, and there, very worn on it, was R.V. Williams. She didn't want me to know they'd been his binoculars.
After 18 years, Fanny Farrer gave up running the festival and moved away.
She couldn't feel interest in other men. She was friendly with lots of them, but didn't seem able to go further.
She never married?
No. He was always there.
The Fourth Symphony in 1934 bewildered his friends. The There was nothing romantic, nothing pastoral here. It came at the time of growing frustration in his home life and the rise of Hitler. Vaughan Williams had found a new language, but it was still indisputably his.
You see, this is a well of passion building up. Because this is the way whatever was inside could get out.
It's an incredibly angry work. My goodness, it really stirs you up. He was a real human being, and that's a genuinely modernistic work, shatteringly dissonant.
I was doing the ironing, and I always had the radio on when I was ironing, and I suddenly heard this extraordinary music, like nothing that I'd ever heard before. And yet, in some strange way, it made all the rest of music fall into place.
This is the way he erupts. This is why he had to write music.
VW always hated his music being given meanings. He did discuss this F minor symphony with a friend, but was cagey about what had been in his mind.
I agree with you that all music must have beauty. The problem being, what is beauty? So when you say you do not think my F minor symphony is beautiful, my answer must be that I do think it beautiful, not that I did not mean it to be beautiful because it reflects unbeautiful times, because we know that beauty can come from unbeautiful things. As a matter of fact, I'm not at all sure that I like it myself now. All I know is that it is what I wanted to do at the time. I wrote it not as a definite picture of anything external, e.g. the state of Europe, but simply because it occurred to me like this. I can't explain why.
He may have been thinking about what was going on in Germany. He may have been thinking about what was going on in his own life, but he's basically thinking about how he could write this symphony. I mean, he was interested in music.
He was a big man. He had a big voice, too, you know, and he jolly well used it, bless his heart.
If things went wrong and people were stupid, then he got very cross.
He could be frightening, obviously. I mean, he had the rage of Zeus.
He couldn't bear being late. I remember once he was telling me that he was going somewhere and the train was late coming in. And when he got into the train, he found that he'd screwed his gloves up so much that he'd torn them in the middle.
The famous picture of him haranguing an orchestra, I wouldn't want to get on the wrong side of VW in a rage, and you hear that in the music.
One of the soloists didn't arrive for a rehearsal, but he left word with the secretary that, don't worry, I know it backwards. And Vaughan Williams immediately, very, very angry, he was very, very angry. He said, well, I don't want him to send me it backwards.
Vaughan Williams was now well into middle age. One of his stage works of the time exemplified the tensions in his personal life. The virtuous patience of the biblical character Job is sorely tested through many tribulations at the hands of God and Satan. After 30 years of Ralph's high-minded marriage, Job was to become the catalyst for change.
It's so glamorous in its wonderful satanic manner. It's really beautiful.
This 1930 ballet is based on drawings by William Blake. Rather like Milton in Paradise Lost, Blake portrayed Satan as an attractive, handsome figure.
Gosh, it's masculine stuff, that.
You feel that Vaughan Williams has almost got a bit of sympathy for Satan here.
Oh, yes,
He
yes.
likes him, doesn't
Well, everybody likes Satan, really. he certainly does, as far as I can tell.
It was the sheer power of this music that first drew the young and beautiful Ursula to Vaughan Williams.
It was at the Old Vic where I was a drama student, and we were allowed to go on Mondays free. And so I went to the ballet every Monday and was rewarded with Job, which knocked me absolutely sideways. I knew the Blake drawings, and I had heard very little music in my life. So it was a surprise, a revelation, and in a way a shock.
Directly because of Job, Ursula eventually contacted Vaughan Williams with a new ballet scenario. He turned it down with a Dear Madam letter. She was now a married woman, but she persisted until she managed to meet him.
I think she wrote him a fan letter, didn't she, and managed to get him to take her out to lunch.
The date was fixed for March the 31st, 1938, in a letter from Rafe. But ironically, the way things turned out, the handwriting was not Rafe's, but Adeline's. Ursula anticipated the encounter by writing a poem which was strangely prophetic.
Flesh to this meeting moves aware and sensual, threading between casual moments and things to loves predestined by some choice, made with both mind and voice, but blindly. Mind like a bird in air, a comet scars with flight, the distance and delight to find such freedom there, but will not stare behind to trace the path we find blindly. I am two fools, I know, for loving and for saying so.
March the 31st dawned, a day that would complicate both their lives for many years and change them forever. Events unfolded in London, which was still the place where Rafe's heart beat fastest. He'd arranged to collect Ursula from her parents' flat there. She was impressed that he kept the taxi waiting, and by his green pork pie hat.
He was very tall, and he was very beautiful, and he was perfect.
Some 60 years later, Ursula spoke for the only time about what happened on that momentous day. It was in a research interview for a book, which has never been heard before.
My mother and father were there, and I looked at him and I thought, he's a beautiful man. And she said, well, I think we should go and get the taxi. So I said, oh yes. And my father and mother looked at me and they said, well, we've got a taxi, we should go. So we went.
She later told friends that in the taxi, voice, eyes, hands were somehow familiar, so that I felt I was meeting again someone I'd known before, and this recognition was the same for him.
After the lunch, the taxi stopped short. They clutched hands, and at that point, there was a romantic embrace and a passionate kiss.
And Ray clutched me in his arms, gave me a terrific kiss. I said, well, I'm not used to this. He said, well, you'll be soon.
Now, I'm unclear as to whether he initiated the passionate kiss or she initiated it. But whatever the situation, she certainly enjoyed it, and she told me that he was a terrific kisser.
And then by the time I went to see him off, I found I'd absolutely got it badly. See, I fell in love absolutely full, and that was very, very difficult, frightful and complicated. This has happened.
It was, you know, like that.
It was instantaneous. Well, I'm sure it was.
Ambushed by love is the word. You just never know when it's going to hit you.
And I was lying awake all night thinking about, oh, God, I think it's a lovely. I rang him up and said, please could you come and see me? So he came, she had half his face shaved and the other half was.
He was loving. He was really loving. And I adored him.
She responded to their first meeting by sending him some of her poetry. He told her, I loved having your poems, the one about your hair particularly. When I unplait my hair at night, I touch it as a stranger might. It was now some 5 years since Ursula's marriage to an army officer, Michael Wood. He was often away on duty, and she rented a small flat in London just north of Oxford Street. Living in the same block was her friend, Jean Stewart.
I have never, ever seen anybody so in love with anybody. She made it very clear to me that he was her property and I wasn't coming of that. I wasn't tempted to, really. I could see that she absolutely lost her heart to him. And I think in the end it worked both ways.
The Serenade to Music later that year was ostensibly VW's tribute to the conductor Henry Wood. But those sounds of music had a settled romantic glow that spoke of personal experience.
I think the occasion of that work was his meeting and love of Ursula. I think that this brought about an extraordinary release of feeling, of sustained feeling. It's not to say that Vaughan Williams had not been incredibly vigorous and passionate previously. But it's the specific expression of that work which I think is new.
Ralph and Ursula were now involved in an intense secret affair that was to last 15 years. The Valentine poems she lavished on him each February have recently come to light. Although he remained based at home in Dorking, and she was often in London, there were no half measures in their relationship. That remains for some a delicate subject, even 50 years after his death.
In his nature, there was an earthiness and a passionate quality which was not nourished as it could have been. And when Ursula came upon the scene, maybe she was able to give him some of this.
And while it didn't disturb his devotion to Adeline, it provided another dimension in his life.
Opened new doors.
Opened new doors.
I should think the question was that there was very little sex in the marriage with Adeline, whereas Ursula sort of transformed his life completely. I think when he met Ursula, he'd never had a love affair like that before.
My understanding from Ursula was that they consummated their relationship physically very shortly after they met. Within a few dates, let's say.
And how long did that last?
Until the day he died.
She was really extraordinarily beautiful herself. Very, very pronounced and definite. Whereas Adeline was the other thing, very sort of wispy. So I understand how it all worked. And it was lovely for Rafe. He really was lucky.
The correspondence between Rafe and Ursula was affectionate but mostly discreet. A year into the affair, Ursula encountered his wife in London. Indeed, they all met up at a performance of Vaughan Williams's romantic opera, Hugh the Drover.
Present were Rafe and Adeline Vaughan Williams, and Michael and Ursula Wood. Hugh the Drover rides into town and romances the town beauty.
It's early Vaughan Williams. It's so romantic and sort of windblown. It is just as passionate, sensuous and erotic as Puccini.
It must have been an extraordinarily uncomfortable evening.
Some months later, Ursula was invited down to Dorking for tea at the Whitegates. She was clearly nervous of meeting Adeline on her home ground. She reported that Adeline was alarming in her high-backed wheelchair. She seemed infinitely older than Rafe, she said, and her fragility, her crooked hands, her grey hair and pallor seemed to remove her from life's ordinariness. It was a relief when the other guests arrived. One of VW's associates told Byron Adams he had a similar reaction after visiting the Whitegates.
One of the startling things that he said was that Adeline Vaughan Williams had a tongue like a viper, and that he was very frightened of her.
Ursula did spend time with her husband, Michael, during his rare periods of leave, but she said they'd begun to feel like strangers. Years later, she confided in some of her friends that she'd become pregnant.
Ursula told me twice, in 1994 and 1997, that she had at one time had to have an abortion. Now, she very much wanted to believe that the child was Vaughan Williams's. However, we don't know whose child it was. This was her decision, as she stressed to me. Neither Michael Wood nor Rafe Vaughan Williams put her up to it in any way.
Were they aware of it?
Oh yes, she told them both.
Then, in June 1942, in the middle of the Second World War, Ursula's husband Michael died suddenly of a heart attack. The news reached London in a telegram which was opened by her neighbour, Jean Stewart.
And it so happened, BW was having gone to Ursula upstairs, so I telephoned and I said, could you ask the uncle, I've always called him that, to come down for a minute, so I want to ask him something. And it looked rather to me as if I'd interrupted something, because he wasn't awfully pleased. But I didn't say anything. I showed him this telegram, which said her husband had died. so he just took it upstairs, showed it to her, and took her back to Dorking, where they looked after her for a bit.
Ralph now made clear to Ursula that he would never leave his invalid wife, and Adeline played her cards shrewdly by continually inviting her to Dorking. This generosity kept a jealous Ursula on the back foot.
Adeline was charming. She wore black mostly. But I bought her another one, a dark brown one, with loose sleeves that they tied up. I don't think she was really pleased with that. She was crippled, and I know it was absolutely agony to have that. She was really miserable.
The war, as for so many people, served to intensify and complicate these personal relationships. For Vaughan Williams, the Blitz brought back into focus his own active service 25 years earlier and the principles that had motivated him. This time he took on war work as a civilian. He had no doubt where his moral duty lay. He did respect the pacifist conviction of the young composer Michael Tippett and wrote a testimonial in his support. But at the same time he told him with some vehemence he was wrong. If your house was on fire, he wrote, you would not ignore it and go on writing until you'd helped to put it out and saved the inmates. If for no other reason, because if your music paper was burnt, you would not be able to go on composing. As he reached 70, Vaughan Williams was the doyen of British music. Symphony No. 5, which he'd been working on ever since he met Ursula, came as unforeseen balm in the midst of battle.
I was simply knocked sideways by this work. It was 1944, and it was the time of what we called the buzz bombs, the flying bombs, the V1s. I was working in the bowels of the overseas department of the BBC, living like a mole, in appalling air, and sleeping there and working there and so on. And I'd been on duty, and Simona Pakenham's first husband, Noel Iliff, said, I'd like to play you this piece. And so we sat in a studio, and he played me the Fifth Symphony. I mean, it's one of the most wonderful musical experiences I've ever had, and I've listened to music all my life. We were so tired of living underground and never knowing if we'd see the next day, you know.
In Surrey, the Vaughan Williamses too were anxious about the doodlebugs and the ominous cutout of their engines. During one night raid, Adeline invited Ursula to join them in the bedroom. Ursula lay on a mattress between Adeline's bed and Ralph's, holding hands with both of them in reassurance.
I was very frightened. I was horrified.
Ralph and Adeline slept in adjoining beds, and Ursula lay in between the two of them on the floor.
Yes. We all sat there, and we were clenching that.
This extraordinary image was an emblem of the balance that Ralph seemed to have found between the two women in his life.
wonderful, wonderful, wonderful tune.
Not many composers manage serenity. Bach does it and Beethoven does it, but Vaughan Williams, who saw the dark side of things, nevertheless is serene. He can face the world and all its nastiness and still remain serene while encompassing it.
Where does it come from? This is what we all want to know. We can sort of understand how a painter paints and how a poet finds words, but where does this...
Much of the symphony drew on his love of John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, but it's hard not to connect its inner radiance with his feelings for Ursula.
As she told me, all of the symphonies from number 5 on are mine, and she's right.
The moral duty about which Ralph was so certain as regards war was perhaps harder to work out in terms of Adeline and Ursula.
But it must have been a fairly friendly relationship, or they would hardly have been all sleeping in one room during the Blitz. So I think Adeline must have accepted Ursula.
I dare say there might have been a few people who thought it a scandal, but they didn't blazon it abroad. Mind you, she always appeared with him at concerts and that.
But friends and family often misunderstood the way Ursula fitted in, and no one rushed to put them right.
She was there right through the war, or most of the war. I mean, I think it was her phrase that was her war work, was looking after the VWs.
I think to begin with, she appeared more or less as a sort of nurse or whatever to Adeline. That's how we all took it anyway.
Both my parents were quite shy, but I do know that it used to amuse them enormously that Ina Boyle, the Irish composer, who I think didn't ever understand the relationship, used to refer to Ursula as the secretary.
There was not a very good reception for Ursula in the family, but how unfair that was, I don't know.
Why?
I think they felt that she was probably what my grandmother would call an adventuress or something like that, you know.
Any remaining doubt over whether Adeline knew about Ralph's affair is dispelled by a Valentine card sent him by Ursula 2 years after the war. The envelope that landed on the White Gate's doormat made little attempt at concealment.
I think all of them were tactful and behaved, I was going to say in a gentlemanly way, whatever the word would be, and were concerned not to hurt each other. I mean, they were all vulnerable.
Did it represent any sort of disloyalty to Adeline?
I can't answer that. I really don't know. She might have sanctioned it and been glad for him, who knows?
Of all the great composers, the one for which Vaughan Williams had lifelong reverence was J.S. Bach. Year after year, he recreated the pain and suffering of the Bach Passion settings in performances he conducted in Dorking.
It was the first time the Passion really meant anything to me.
If I listen to the recording that was made of his performance of the St. Matthew Passion, the whole thing clicks right back into place and all the years fall away.
Vaughan Williams had his own way with Bach. He added in clarinets, and insisted on a piano rather than a harpsichord. For him, the anguish of the Passion was simply the best story ever told, and in the way that Bach himself would have expected, everyone present had a role to play. That was a passionate part of his musical philosophy.
His shouting of the Barabbas was louder than any choir had ever been, because he wanted them to make it sound as if it was really so important. He made everybody scream, you know.
We used to get quite het up over crucify him. We all were tingling on the edges of our, I've never known such emotion, really, as when he conducted. He went through it himself. That was why it wasn't his beat, it was his heart, really, that he threw into it.
It was very thrilling, and he turning around to conduct the audience in the chorales,
He would make sure that everybody was standing, and if not, he'd rather like a schoolmaster who would say, "Come on, get up," The
entire audience sang the chorale. It was Ralph's idea.
Probably very authentic.
Yes. Oh, that's what they did in Germany. So he said, well, why don't we have the fun here?
He told his performers, make the words apply to you.
It was a great communal musical event, and we all sang our hearts out.
I like to think of our musical life as a great pyramid, at the apex of which are the great virtuosi performers and composers of international renown. Then, immediately below this, come those devoted musical practitioners, true artists, who by precept and example are spreading the knowledge and love of music in our schools, our choral societies, our musical festivals. Then comes the next layer of our musical structure, that great mass of musical amateurs who make music for the love of it in their spare time and play and sing for their own spiritual recreation in their homes.
In the Matthew, there's a chorus near the end, and people sing, oh, where, oh, where, oh, where. Well, when he was conducting, the oh, wheres went everywhere. People began to laugh a little bit.
He wasn't much help as a conductor, but as an inspirer.
With him, it was anything. You never quite knew what was going to happen. But I trusted him.
In the late 1940s, Vaughan Williams could have sat on his laurels, but he kept on exploring. His Sixth Symphony emerged from the shadow of the new Iron Curtain. Serenity and certainty had vanished. Instead, it ended with 12 minutes of undiluted pianissimo, bleak, uncomfortable music that cannot settle or find rest.
I can remember the audience looked fairly shocked at the end of that. You've been taken to somewhere very, very dark.
It told me about finality. It told me about the concept of nuclear winter. It told me about nothingness.
Somebody else called it agnostic's paradiso, which I thought was a wonderful way of describing that music.
Adeline was now in her twilight years. She was almost 80 and had become virtually immobile.
She was very much a sort of ghost by that time in the background. My sister, for instance, said that she became a sort of figure saying very little, sitting in a chair at the back of the room.
Ralph could have been forgiven for wondering, when will this long, weary day have end?
Listen to the chords. Is it E flat major? Is it E minor? Who knows?
Adeline died in May 1951. Ursula wrote of her derelict body with a wrecked face lying on the iron bed, an influence still to be felt as if she'd not entirely relinquished her hold. Her death provoked in Ralph a torrent of rage.
He smashed her chair, Adeline's chair, and began to rip up photographs.
When he got back from the funeral, it was photographs and things of certain of her relatives that he threw away or burned. He was supposed to say, there, that's all finished with.
Although we all know that Ralph was not an obvious Christian, in spite of all his wonderful hymns, it was a spiritual quality that made me think that everything would be all right.
He was a man who had great awe. He certainly didn't regard himself as the centre of the universe.
I think he was a religious composer, yes, but he was undoubtedly an agnostic religious composer.
They don't understand what they're talking about when they say, did he really believe this and that? Idiotic. His whole life was giving people lovely things to listen to, being so nice himself and generous to the young. I mean, if I could think of any more Christian than Ralph, I simply can't.
In February 1953, Ralph and Ursula were married quietly. He was 80, she was 41. At last they could be open, as the card they sent to their friends showed. You will, we think, not be surprised, they said.
Yeah, how nice. I don't remember getting that card. Yes, go on.
Well, what? I mean, it's rather an unusual way of putting it. What?
Well, I suppose we all knew they'd been lovers, if that's what you mean. Very discreetly.
Now they made up for lost time. Ralph had never flown before. They travelled to France, Germany, Austria, Italy, Greece, as well as all over Britain. And they crossed the Atlantic.
It was a perfect marriage, and they had such fun together.
They fitted in a trip right across the United States to go and see the Grand Canyon, which he'd never seen. They never stopped travelling after that.
We went everywhere. We went absolutely everywhere.
The long exile in Dorking was over. He moved back to London to a grand house overlooking Regent's Park. The exuberance of his Eighth Symphony spoke of a man in the prime of life.
The Hanover Terrace house was very beautiful. She had filled it with beautiful things. I remember it as full of light and sunlight and laughter.
He suddenly came up with this ridiculous rhyme. Uncle Joe and Auntie Mabel fainted at the breakfast table. Children, let this be a warning, never do it in the morning.
He and Ursula used to seize upon Vogue the moment it came out, and they would go through it, and he would make a little note of all the pairs of shoes that he'd like to see her wearing.
She was a wonderful dresser, and Rafe, so she told me, he didn't tell me that directly, he loved her in high heels, and she was rather tall, but that didn't matter.
They must have gone out every night in London to either a concert or a theatre or something, or had people to dinner or entertain. I mean, it must have been heaven for him.
He was very serious and he laughed all the time.
But he was now in his mid-80s. For one of his 4 last songs, he set a poem by Ursula, written as she watched him.
Sleep, and I'll be still as another sleeper, holding you in my arms, glad that you lie so near at last. This sheltering midnight is our meeting place. No passion or despair or hope divide me on your side. This sheltering midnight is our meeting place. No passion or despair or hope divide me from your side. I shall remember firelight on your sleeping face. I shall remember shadows growing deeper as the fire fell to ashes and the minutes passed. I shall remember firelight on your sleeping face. I shall remember shadows growing deeper as the fire fell to ashes and the minutes passed. Okay.
When Vaughan Williams turned 85, it emerged that he'd been writing yet another symphony, his 9th. Despite all the activity, the creative urge never slackened, as one of his young composer friends overheard.
When the fire was up, he would come up with extraordinary new things. It was about 4 a.m. Simply out of my sleep, I heard this extraordinary sound trickling down through the ceiling where there was a little honky-tonk piano. And then stomp, stomp, stomp as he'd go back to his desk. And then he'd go back to the piano and went on and on and on. He was working on, as I realized later, the slow movement of the Ninth Symphony. It was very strange music. Music actually being called forth from silence and from the night. It was a magical experience, obviously, for me as a young composer to hear above this very great man searching for his own dream.
I think he's England's greatest composer of the 20th century, and I adore and know nearly all of Elgar, one of my favourite of all composers. But I do place Vaughan Williams above that.
The older I get, I think I love it even more. And having worked a lot with Britten and Tippett, it is so equal to them and just so different.
I find it more enriching the longer I live. I can swallow it whole, even the weaker pieces. So that's its significance. It doesn't change. But I hope I change in listening to it.
The brooding unease of the Ninth Symphony escaped its first audience. They cheered him to the echo, but few understood it. Only later did they realize his passions had taken him further on, into another world.
I wrote to VW afterwards and said that I was very impressed, but I didn't quite get the hang of it, basically. Anyway, he said, "Dear Jeremy, thank you so much for writing. I am so glad you liked it, as far as you did. As the man said about Brahms, it ought never to be heard for the first time. I hope you're doing some fine composition yourself. Ursula sends her love. Yours, RVW." Touché.